In this video, we address the strong and the weak in Romans chapters 14 and 15. We're going to raise questions like, were these real or hypothetical groups? Who is Paul addressing? Why is he addressing them? And what is the place of his address to the strong and the weak in the letter of Romans as a whole? Is it central to the letter? Is it subsidiary to the letter? Or is it something else entirely? Paul's comments about the strong and the weak occur at the very end of the letter to Romans in chapters 14 and 15 in a section that gives us more information about the circumstances behind Romans than perhaps any other chapters in the entire letter. In chapter 16, Paul addresses a number of different named individuals. More named individuals than he does in any of his other letters. And scholars often purport some things about the Roman churches, the Roman house churches, based on those names. We sort of take that back, if we move backwards from Romans chapter 16, and the information that we can sort of gather about the demographics of the Roman house churches from the people that are addressed in Romans chapter 16, and we move back into Romans chapters 14 and 15, we might have a hint at sort of what is going on in those particular house churches. And it may be the case that what everything Paul has written beforehand, especially in chapters 1 through 11, but even up through 13, were meant as a way to prepare for what he has to say about the strong and the weak in Romans chapter 14 and 15. With respect to the historical setting context of Romans in these particular chapters, we also have the Jerusalem collection mentioned here, which is sort of a key sticking point with respect to the purpose of Romans. That for many scholars, the Jerusalem collection, the fact that Paul is planning to visit Rome and gather money from the Roman churches and bring it along to Jerusalem, is also key to thinking about the purpose of Romans as a whole, and is situated in these letters. So what we have in this section is sort of perhaps a whole lot of information about what is going on in the Roman house churches, the kinds of things that Paul is trying to address, and why he lays out his gospel and his theology in order to address these issues later on at the end of the letter. And so it is into this literary context that Paul writes his comments to the strong and the weak in Romans chapters 14 and 15. In one of our readings for this week, you are going to see Dr. Scott McKnight make the claim that these particular chapters and the particular issue that Paul is addressing here is the interpretive key to all of Romans. And Scott McKnight is not alone in this position. There are other scholars who think that these chapters are critical to understanding what's going on in Romans as a whole. So Dr. McKnight says the instructions to the weak and the strong are the core of Paul's lived theology, that Paul is really sort of trying to get to that lived theology at the end of Romans, and that's why he lays out some of the more theoretical theology early on. And so that it's the aim, these instructions to the strong and the weak are the aim of the entire letter. He says that this claim that he's just made changes how we read Romans. And so what's interesting is that if you look to 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10, you find very similar issues being addressed. The issue of what one ought to eat or not eat, and how a community ought to get along when there are differing opinions about what might be eaten and what might not be eaten. And Paul seems to come to similar conclusions in both Romans 14 and 15 and 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. And he sort of leaves space for multiple options, and it's okay to eat, it's okay not to eat, particularly food sacrificed to idols, but you ought to do sort of what is best for the community and what most glorifies God, that what you should sort of be convinced in your own mind about the right kind of practices. Paul thinks, sort of theoretically speaking, it is okay for his audience to eat meat sacrificed to idols. Sort of in both Romans 14 and 15 and 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, that seems to be the conclusion that he comes to, or the sort of sub-conclusion that he comes to. And then the ultimate conclusion, though, is that you must do what is best for community and what is best with respect to glorifying God. And so the question then is, are these real groups or theological constructs that Paul is addressing, particularly in Romans? It seems much more clear that in 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10, that Paul is addressing a real situation that he knows, insofar as he founded the Corinthian churches. He knows the people there. He has been there, and he sort of knows what's going on at the ground level. Whether that's the case in Romans chapters 14 and 15 is more of an open question. And so to get at that open question, we sort of need to understand some things about the weak and the strong based on Romans chapter 14 and 15 and what Paul says particularly about these two different groups. So in Romans 14:1, we have Paul sort of opening up and engaging the question, saying that you are to welcome those who are weak in faith, not for the purpose of quarreling over opinions. And then over in Romans 15:1, one chapter later, he says, "We who are strong ought to put up with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves." So two different groups clearly in mind here for Paul. And he's going to give specific instructions, and I have put the Greek up here so that you can see the terms for strong and weak here. So welcome the weak in faith, ton de asteun ta, that's the weak ones. And then we who are strong ought to put up with the failings of the weak. So once again, we have the asthenamata, is that asthen root is our root for the weak there, and the root for the strong is hoi dunatai, literally the powerful ones. Ought to put up with the weaknesses of the non-powerful ones. Ton a dunaton in Romans 15:1. So two different groups, one characterized by weakness and not power, another characterized by strength and power. And so Paul includes himself, interestingly, in the second group. And the question is whether Paul includes himself in the second group sort of rhetorically or actually. Does Paul actually sort of hold to all the beliefs that the strong do, namely that you can eat whatever you want to eat, you don't need to celebrate certain days? So, if that is the case, Paul would not engage in sort of kosher law or celebration of Sabbath, that those things would no longer be of importance to him. That could be the case. Or it could be the case that when Paul says we, he sort of means that rhetorically. He includes himself in the group of the strong as a way to sort of address them in a manner that he identifies with them and is sort of able to guide them by including himself within that particular group. And what characterized these two groups, Paul explicitly says with respect to the weak in verse 3 of chapter 14 and verse 5 of chapter 14, that they only eat vegetables. And this might be a sort of exaggeration, a characterization, a sort of characterizing them beyond the actual practice of not eating meat. They don't eat the meat sacrificed to idols, and they only eat vegetables. Sort of Paul might be hyperbolizing here. But it has something to do, of course, with what they eat, and particularly not eating certain kinds of foods. And then also judging one day better than another. So then on the flip side, the strong are going to do the opposite of this, that they're going to consider all foods okay for eating, and they're going to judge all days as equal. And though both groups, no matter what they do with respect to food and their judgment of days, there's a temptation for them, for both groups, that Paul addresses in verses 3 and 4 of chapter 14, to judge others who think and act differently. And so Paul seems to be more concerned with the judgment than he is with the actual action. He is going to give he does in his letters sort of give advice about what to eat, what not to eat, that ultimately it's okay to eat, but he's more concerned with the judgment in community. Sort of the acting in community is what's going to be more important than anything else. And finally, with respect to these two groups, what we're going to find is that the weak is actually addressed minimally and the strong is addressed extensively, that they get a whole chapter, whereas the weak only get, a handful of verses. And so this is going to sort of lead many to conclude that the strong is the sort of majority group in Romans, that those are the ones that Paul is really addressing, and that they are also probably the predominant group. That is, there's a greater population of the strong in the Roman house churches than there is the population of the weak in the Roman house churches. To state that the strong are the more populous group in the Roman house churches is to assume that Paul knows about the situation on the ground, and that the strong and the weak are real groups in Rome. But that is an open question, and not all scholars believe that Paul has real groups in mind, or he knows of sort of members of these particular groups. This might be a real situation that Paul is addressing, which is where I would sort of place myself into that camp. But it also might be a hypothetical situation, a hypothetical conflict that Paul has sort of started thinking about and writing about how one ought to engage in community beginning in Romans chapter 12. And sort of this thing comes to mind because it is an issue elsewhere with the other congregations or the other cities to which Paul writes. So he thinks, I better bring this thing up because this is likely to be an issue in Rome. Because of the number of individuals that Paul addresses in Romans chapter 16, I believe that he sort of has a better idea of what's going on the ground than it is that he sort of thinks of all of this hypothetically. But there is a case to be made that this is a hypothetical situation insofar as Paul did not found these churches, remember. So there's a chance that he maybe doesn't quite know what's going on the ground, as Romans 16 might lead us to believe. And also with respect to the sort of centrality of this particular issue, Paul doesn't raise the issue until the end of the letter. If it was as important as some scholars would have it be, then we might expect Paul to at least flag the issue earlier on in Romans and not wait until the very end of the letter, after presumably the audience has been listening for 45 minutes to an hour or so, and then finally Paul raises this issue at Romans chapter 14. If it was as important and if it was a real live issue and the central issue that Paul is trying to address, we might expect it to show up earlier. And then lastly, there's sort of the question of what it even means to be a Jewish Christian, and whether sort of Jewish Christian is a live category or group in Paul's mind, and whom Paul is addressing. That Paul is largely seems to be concerned with sort of addressing Gentiles. We've seen that thread sort of run throughout Romans. So the question of whether or not Paul is addressing sort of a Jewish Christian group, whether that be the strong or the weak, is those categories are a little bit fuzzy. And so then with respect to whom these different groups might be, there are a number of different options, including something like Jewish Christians, for both the strong and the weak. But what seems to be clear with respect to the strong and the weak is the strong are in some way non-Torah observant. That is, they are not observing the commands to not eat particular foods, and the commands to observe particular days as special, namely the Sabbath, whereas the weak do appear to be Torah observant in some way. And so then it could be that the weak are Torah observant Jewish Christians. That is to say, they're ethnically Jewish and they're still they hold on to those aspects of their ethnic Jewishness. Or it could be that they are Torah observant Gentile Christians. That is to say, they worship the Jewish God through the death and resurrection of Jesus, but they have sort of a temptation to do the stuff of Torah, just like other groups that Paul addresses are tempted to become circumcised, that they are Gentile believers in Jesus who believe they need to do certain things of the Torah. So sort of a variety of different options for who might be addressed here. And we're going to do a quick lecture pause, because what we'll find in the commentaries is that different commentators make different things about who the strong are, who the weak are, and whether or not a real or hypothetical situation is being addressed in these chapters. So what I want you to do is take a quick pause of the video here, look to your optional commentator for this week, and see what position they hold with respect to whether this is a real or a hypothetical conflict, and who the strong and who the weak are. The ethnicity of who the strong and the weak are truly matters for Paul's comments in these chapters, insofar as our identity, our ethnic identity, is very often tied up with eating and food practices. And what I'm going to show you in just a moment here is the way in which ancient Jews and non Jews talked about eating and food and how this was related to their identity. So it's one thing for Paul to call a Gentile who is trying to observe Jewish food law weak. It's another thing for Paul to call someone who is Jewish and is still observing aspects of their Jewish identity with respect to eating practices weak. And so we're going to come back to this slide in just a moment here. What I'm going to do is put up a number of different authors who sort of reflect on food, Jewishness, and identity in different kinds of ways. But what I want to do first is remind us of sort of the non-negotiable Jewish beliefs and practices in Paul's context and how Paul reframes those. So if you've been in classes with me before, you've seen this slide and the one that is to come, the sort of idea, the core ideas that sort of make the circle of Jewish identity, that there is one God to be worshipped. The Jews only worship one God, not multiple gods, and not a polytheistic religion, and that this one God is in a covenantal relationship with the Jewish people and has determined how that relationship is to be lived out sort of on both sides through the Torah, through Jewish scriptures, and prescribing particular ways of living and acting. And then for Paul, Jesus comes in and sort of redraws the lines, redraws these central concepts, especially for Gentiles. That sort of the idea of monotheism, theism, the idea of covenant, the idea of Torah, all has to be reconsidered and reinterpreted in light of the death and resurrection of Jesus. The sort of boundaries of God's covenantal relationship get redrawn, and Gentiles in particular are able to worship the Jewish God sort of through this apocalyptic event of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so it's one thing for Gentiles to reinterpret and to sort of live out Torah a different way in Paul's context. And it's sort of a less radical thing. To say that Gentiles no longer have to do the stuff of Torah. It is a much more bold and radical claim if Paul is saying Jews no longer have to do the stuff of Torah. Jews no longer need to follow kosher laws. And we sometimes forget that, being most of us ourselves not ethnically Jewish. And we sort of can recover the sort of boldness that the claim would be for Paul to say that Jews do not have to sort of practice certain food laws or certain aspects of Torah by looking at what Jews and non-Jews say about Jewishness, food, and identity. And so what we're going to do here is look at 7 different authors who sort of reflect on this in different ways in different time periods. So some of them, one of them is particularly going to be from the Old Testament. Then we're going to get a span of authors from roughly contemporaneous with Paul, Second Temple Jewish authors, and then we're going to look at one Roman author who reflects on Jewish identity in a way to sort of recover how central what one eats and sort of a couple other practices of Torah, how they're important for Jewish identity. So we're going to begin here with Leviticus chapter 11, verses 7 through 8, and I'm going to read each one of these texts for us. So this is, of course, from the Torah itself. It says, "The pig, for even though it has divided hooves and is cleft-footed, it does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you. Of their flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. They are unclean for you." So one of the places where pork is sort of banned from Jewish eating practices in Leviticus. So sort of the root of the issue here of what one should eat, or what one should not eat. And then in Daniel chapter 1, we have Daniel being praised for sort of his eating practices. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. So he asked the palace master to allow him not to defile himself. Now God allowed Daniel to receive favor and compassion from the palace master. The palace master said to Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king. He has appointed your food and your drink. If he should see you in poorer condition than the other young men of your own age, you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel asked the guard whom the palace master had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables and water to eat and drink. You can then compare our appearance with the appearance of the young men who eat the royal rations and deal with your servants according to what you observe. So Daniel's fact of not eating the royal palace food is sort of an aspect of holding to his Jewishness. And particularly interesting here is the fact that they are only given vegetables, maybe a slight echo between Romans chapters 14 and 15 and Daniel chapter 1 here. It's notable that Daniel is written in sort of the post-exilic context later than most other Old Testament texts. And so Daniel is propped up in this context for holding true to his Jewish identity with respect to what he does not eat. Similarly, in First Maccabees, even closer to Paul's context, but also close to the context of Daniel, we have many in Israel stood firm in the face of the decrees of to sort of not act Jewishly, and they were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. So when they're commanded to eat the unclean food, they resolve in their hearts not to do it. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or to profane the holy covenant, and they did die. So the fact of eating unclean food is raised to a very high level here in First Maccabees, that once again, it is celebrated that one not eat the unclean food, and that it is better to die than to sort of forsake Jewish identity and eat the unclean food. In the letter of Aristeas, which is written again around the same time and context as First Maccabees and Daniel, probably a little bit after both of them. Aristeas says, "For you must not fall into the degrading idea that it was out of regard to mice and weasels and other such things that Moses drew up his laws with such exceeding care. All these ordinances were made for the sake of righteousness, to aid the quest for virtue and the perfecting of character. Therefore, all the rules which Moses has laid down with regard to what is permitted in the case of these birds and other animals, he has enacted with the object of teaching us a moral lesson." So for Aristeas, it's he's saying here, it's not so much, or the main purpose is not sort of that you should or shouldn't eat this animal or that animal. While that is still going to be important for Aristeas, Aristeas is saying there's actually something philosophical going on here. There's something about virtue and the development of ethics with respect to the food laws in the Old Testament. The rules that are laid down are meant to help one with respect to their morality. So what one eats and what one doesn't eat is actually a moral issue, and sort of following Jewish kosher laws allows one to have better moral development. Sort of it's not just what one eats that's part of the identity, but what one eats sort of also forms one's moral identity. And then over in Tobit, written after probably all of these texts, but set in an earlier period, set in the narrative itself is set in during the Assyrian Empire, and Tobit is taken captive to Assyria and the capital city of Nineveh. Every one of my kindred and my people ate the food of the Gentiles, but I kept myself from eating the food of the Gentiles, because I was mindful of God with all my heart. The Most High gave me favor and good standing with Shalmaneser, and I used to buy everything he needed. So so Tobit says, in this context where Israel is, taken captive by Assyria, the people are eating unclean food, but Tobit stands out for not forsaking Jewish kosher laws, that he is keeping those laws, and that sets him apart. Again, something to be celebrated. What one eats as a Jew is core to their identity, and sets them apart. And we find again the same thing in the text Joseph and Aseneth, which is written closer to Paul's context, and by how some date the text, maybe even after Paul's context, Joseph comes into the house of Pentephres and sits down at a table. This is the patriarch Joseph. He washed his feet and he placed a table in front of him by itself because he would not eat with the Egyptians, for this was an abomination to him. So in the narrative context, Joseph doesn't eat with non-Jews, that is, with Gentiles, in this case specifically Egyptians, because of the food set before Egyptians would have been unclean, and that there's such an importance on eating the clean food that even being in the presence of those who are eating unclean foods is not something that Joseph could do. And this is sort of an exaggeration of Jewish food laws in a way. But it reveals the fact that this is very much a live issue for the author of Joseph and Aseneth. That sort of Joseph and Aseneth knows and is projecting back onto Joseph the sort of distinction between Gentile eating and Jewish eating. And we see this one more time. This is going to be our last text here in a non-Jewish text, the Roman satirist Juvenal. And so he's going to be sort of making fun of Jews here for their particular practices. So you can sort of read and hear the anti-Judaism that is prevalent even in the ancient context. So Juvenal, writing in a closely contemporaneous with Paul and in sort of close dating proximity, he says that some happen to have been dealt a father who respects the Sabbath. That is, some people have Jewish fathers. They worship nothing except the clouds and the spirit of the sky. So they don't worship idols. They don't worship multiple gods. They don't worship things made. This is, of course, we see this all over with respect to with Judaism in the period, and even in Paul, that sort of back in Romans chapter 1, Paul critiques idolaters, those who worship idols, things made by human hands. Juvenal says that they think there is no difference between pork, which their fathers abstained from, and human flesh. So that Juvenal is saying that eating pork for Jews is the same as eating human flesh, and it is that off limits. That eating pork is the same as being a cannibal to Jews. In time, they get rid of their foreskins, that is, they undergo circumcision. And with their habit of despising the laws of Rome, they study, observe, and revere the Judaic code as handed down by Moses in his mystic scroll, which tells them not to show the way to anyone except a fellow worshiper, and if asked, to take only the circumcised to the fountain, that is, only allow those who are circumcised to worship. So you can see here how circumcision and what Paul says about circumcision is very much a live issue, and then it's known beyond the context of Judaism. Juvenal continues, but it's their fathers who are to blame, taking every seventh day as a day of laziness and separate from ordinary life. So then here, Juvenal making fun of the Sabbath, saying the Sabbath is not actually a day of reverence for God, it's just a day to be lazy. So all of this to say, sort of these things about Jewish identity that are central to Jewish identity are very well known beyond Judaism. That Greeks and Romans would have known that these are particular features of Jews. And here, once again, we have some of those core issues: circumcision, Sabbath observance, what to eat and what not to eat. All of those things commanded in Torah with respect to how to be in covenantal relationship. We also have this bit about monotheism at the beginning of the chapter. So all of this to say, the issue of what one eats or does not eat, and the issue to not eat particular food, as central to one's Jewish identity, is not small potatoes. There is it's a large live issue. And so for Paul to be saying that Jews should be able to just eat whatever they want would be a much bigger claim. Sort of flies in the face of all of that stuff that was just read. That's a much bigger claim than Paul saying Gentiles can eat whatever. That it doesn't matter if Gentiles eat food sacrificed to idols. It doesn't matter if Gentiles eat pig. Gentiles that are in Christ, worshiping the Jewish God. So all of this, to me, if we're going back to sort of thinking about the identity of the strong and the weak, suggests to me that when Paul is writing to the strong, those who eat anything, he is writing to Gentiles who are eating anything. That this is not Jewish Christians who have decided that because of Jesus' death and resurrection, they can eat anything they want. And probably also with respect to the weak. That I think the sort of the live issue of what to eat and what not to eat tips the scales sort of in favor of even the weak probably being Gentile Christians who are tempted to not eat certain foods, to try to keep aspects of Torah by not eating particular food. So it's sort of as though that the identity of that group is akin to who Paul might be addressing in Galatians with respect to the issue of circumcision. But Paul is in Romans a lot sort of softer in his words, not as harsh in his words as he is in Galatians. But we might have a sort of similar identity between the weak in Romans chapters 14 and 15 with respect to the temptation to keep particular Torah, namely with respect to food and eating habits, and those in Galatians who are tempted to undergo certain surgical procedures, namely circumcision, in order to keep Torah. And to sort of live as Jews. So there may be sort of a mirroring there. It seems more likely to me that the weak are Gentile, they are not ethnically Jewish, than it is that they are in fact Jewish. And no matter what their identity is, what's of significance here is that Paul makes space for both options. Paul doesn't say that the weak ought to eat pork, that they should stop not eating certain things, but he's more concerned with how the two groups are going to get along in community. And this brings us full circle to the place of Romans chapters 14 and 15 within the purpose of the letter as a whole. And much depends on sort of what we think Paul is doing with this letter, whether or not he is addressing a contingent specific situation, or whether the letter is more sort of universal and systematic, that Paul is sort of presenting his theology. So if it is the case that Paul is responding to particular circumstances in Rome, and in particularly circumstances of the strong and the weak, this of course would make Romans chapters 14 and 15 central to the letter. And this is the case that Scott McKnight is going to make in the reading for this week that I have uploaded for you. And so then Romans 1 through 13 is sort of the theology, the sort of the foundation by which Paul is able to address the particular situation. If we view Romans more as a systematic or a universal letter, that for one reason or another, Paul is sort of putting his ideas out there, putting his theologies out there, then Romans 1 through 11 is sort of the real presentation of those core ideas. And then chapters 12 through 16 are sort of how to live individually and in community with respect to what has been laid out. And this is sort of the idea that is common and sort of has been the majority viewpoint for some time, that the first 11 chapters of Romans really represent the indicative. That is, what is the case, Paul laying out his theology. And then chapters 12 through 16 represent the imperative, how to live accordingly. So then in this view, it's not that Romans 14 and 15 are sort of central to everything Paul wants to do in the letter, but they are one issue, either real or hypothetical, that comes out of the indicative, the theology that's been laid out in the first 11 chapters.